In the winter of the American frontier, warmth was something people fought for constantly. A man might chop wood from sunrise until dark, yet still wake in the night shivering beside a stove that devoured logs faster than he could replace them. Across Montana in the late 19th century, entire families measured their chances of survival by the size of the wood pile beside their cabins. Fire meant life. Without it, a house became little more than a wooden coffin waiting for the cold to claim whoever slept inside. Yet in a small valley south of Bozeman, there lived a man who seemed completely unconcerned with that rule. His neighbors noticed it first during the summer of 1891, when most settlers were busy hauling timber and stone to build chimneys. Instead of installing a stove or fireplace, the quiet immigrant on the edge of the valley spent weeks shaping long tubes from clay and stacking bales of unwashed sheep's wool beside his half-finished home. The structure itself looked strange from the start. Its walls were unusually thick, far thicker than anything frontier builders normally attempted. Curious riders began stopping to watch the progress, trying to understand what exactly the Mongolian settler was doing. There was no chimney rising above the roofline, no place for smoke to escape, and no sign that the house would ever contain a fire at all. To the ranchers who had spent years battling Montana winters, the design made no sense. One man joked that the foreigner must believe wool walls could scare away frost. Another insisted the man clearly didn't understand how deadly the region's winters could be. Temperatures in the valley had dropped below 40 degrees below zero before. Entire herds had frozen standing upright during storms. Cabins with roaring stoves still formed ice on the inside of their walls. The idea that someone would build a home without a proper hearth seemed almost suicidal. The man behind the strange construction was named Batbayar Ganzorig, though most locals struggled to pronounce it and shortened it simply to Bat. He rarely argued with the men who questioned his design. Instead, he continued working quietly, shaping clay pipes by hand and laying them carefully through the thick walls of his cabin. Those pipes formed a long, winding path that traveled through every side of the building before eventually reaching a small vent near the roof. The design puzzled anyone who saw it. Why would someone fill their walls with pipes instead of building a stove inside? The answer lay thousands of miles away, on the vast grasslands of Mongolia where Batbayar had grown up. Winters there were even more unforgiving than Montana's. Temperatures could plunge so low that exposed skin froze in minutes. Yet generations of nomadic families had survived those conditions without relying on the roaring fireplaces that Americans considered essential. Instead, they had perfected a method of capturing heat rather than wasting it. Fire was never allowed to burn freely inside the living space. Instead, its smoke was forced to travel through long channels built beneath floors or inside walls, slowly releasing its warmth before finally escaping outside. By the time the smoke reached open air, most of the heat had already been absorbed by the structure itself. The house became a giant thermal battery, storing warmth during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. To Batbayar, this method was simply common sense. To the settlers of Montana, it sounded like madness. But while his neighbors believed survival depended on feeding flames every hour, Batbayar was building something very different. An experiment that would soon prove that the frontier's greatest enemy wasn't the cold itself, but the way people were trying to fight it. Batbayar's understanding of cold did not come from books or experiments. It came from a childhood spent in one of the harshest climates on Earth. He had grown up on the vast steppes of northeastern Mongolia, a land where winter could last more than half the year and temperatures often plunged far below anything most Americans had ever experienced. In those regions, survival depended on knowledge passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Families didn't simply build shelters. They built systems designed to work with the cold rather than struggle against it. As a boy, Batbayar had watched elders construct winter dwellings where warmth came not from open flames but from the slow movement of heat through stone and clay. Fires burned outside or in small pits separated from the living area, and the smoke traveled through carefully shaped channels before leaving the structure. Along the way, those channels absorbed heat and stored it inside the building itself. When the fire eventually died, the walls and floors continued releasing warmth for hours. To people raised in that tradition, constantly feeding a stove through the night would have seemed terribly inefficient. Yet when Batbayar first arrived in the United States in the late 1880s, he discovered that this exhausting routine was exactly how most frontier families survived winter. His journey to America had been long and uncertain. Political pressure and economic hardship had pushed many families across Asia to search for opportunity elsewhere. Railroads expanding across the American West needed labor, and word of those jobs eventually reached distant villages across Mongolia and northern China. Like many others hoping for a new beginning, Batbayar traveled east across the continent, boarded a crowded steamship, and crossed the Pacific toward the unfamiliar shores of North America. After passing through immigration inspections and a confusing maze of rail travel, he eventually found himself in the wide valleys of Montana Territory. There, he took whatever work he could find, shearing sheep, repairing fences, and helping ranchers manage livestock. The work was hard, but familiar. What shocked him, however, was how settlers approached winter. His first cold season in Montana nearly convinced him the Americans had misunderstood their own environment. The ranch bunkhouse where he slept contained a large cast-iron stove that burned continuously through the night. The flames roared so fiercely that the metal glowed red, yet frost still formed along the wooden walls. Every few hours someone had to wake up, stumble through the darkness, and feed more logs into the firebox. If the flames weakened even briefly, the temperature in the room dropped quickly enough to wake everyone shivering. Batbayar watched this routine with quiet amazement. To him it seemed as if the men were fighting an endless battle against their own chimney. Most of the heat they worked so hard to create vanished upward with the smoke, disappearing into the winter sky before it could warm the room. The problem was not the amount of wood they burned, it was where the heat was going. Over the next few years, Batbayar saved money from seasonal work and learned as much as he could about the valley where he planned to settle. He noticed that sheep thrived in the grassy foothills and that clay deposits near the riverbanks could be shaped into sturdy building materials. Wool from the animals provided natural insulation if packed densely enough. Slowly, the idea forming in his mind began to take shape. If he could combine the Mongolian heating methods he had grown up with and the materials available in Montana, he believed he could build a house that stayed warm with only a fraction of the firewood other settlers needed. When Batbayar finally purchased a small piece of land south of Bozeman in 1891, most neighbors expected him to build a standard frontier cabin like everyone else. Instead, they watched him begin digging a deep, stone-lined pit several yards away from the place where the house would stand. From that pit, he carved a narrow underground channel pointing toward the future foundation of his home. At first, people assumed he was preparing a cooking area, or perhaps a storage cellar. Only when they noticed the clay pipes being formed and laid along the trench did the rumors begin spreading through the valley. The Mongolian newcomer, people whispered in town, intended to heat his entire house with smoke running through the walls. Some laughed at the idea. Others worried the strange design might poison him in his sleep. But Batbayar continued building calmly, confident that when winter finally arrived, the walls themselves would explain what words could not. By the time autumn approached, Batbayar's unusual cabin had become a subject of constant discussion throughout the valley. The building looked sturdy enough from a distance, but anyone who rode close immediately noticed what was missing. There was no chimney cutting through the roof line, no iron stovepipe sticking into the sky, and no stack of chopped firewood piled beside the door the way every other homestead displayed. Instead, a small stone-covered pit sat several yards away from the house, connected to it by a narrow trench buried beneath the soil. For many of Batbayar's neighbors, that single detail confirmed their suspicions. Smoke, they insisted, had to rise through a chimney if a house was going to stay warm and safe. Sending it underground and into the walls sounded reckless, yet Batbayar remained patient whenever anyone asked questions. In broken but careful English, he explained that the smoke itself was not the goal. The heat carried within it was. If the smoke traveled slowly enough through clay pipes, most of that heat could be captured before the smoke ever reached open air. The idea was difficult for many settlers to accept because it challenged something they had always assumed to be true. On the frontier, fire was treated like a camp companion. Families gathered around it, watching the flames dance while sparks drifted upward into the chimney. Warmth felt strongest near the stove or fireplace, fading quickly toward the edges of the room. Batbyer's system worked in the opposite way. Instead of concentrating heat in one spot, it spread warmth across the entire structure. The clay pipes built into the thick walls formed a long, twisting route for the hot smoke to travel. As the smoke passed through those pipes, the clay absorbed its heat and slowly warmed the surrounding layers of wool and timber. By the time the smoke reached the vent at the far side of the cabin, much of its heat had already been stored inside the walls themselves. When the fire in the pit eventually burned down to ashes, the warmth trapped in the clay continued radiating gently into the living space for hours. Building such a system required careful preparation. The clay used for the pipes had to be mixed with sand, so it would not crack when exposed to repeated heating and cooling. Each pipe section was shaped by hand, forming thick tubes with slightly widened ends so they could fit together like pieces of a long puzzle. After shaping them, Batbyer left the pipes to dry slowly in shaded racks to prevent sudden temperature changes from splitting the clay. Only after weeks of drying did he begin installing them inside the walls of the cabin. The pipes were arranged in a winding pattern, climbing upward through one section of the wall before dipping down again and continuing across the next side of the building. The goal was simple: extend the path of the smoke as much as possible so the heat would have time to transfer into the structure. While Batbyer handled the pipes and masonry, his wife Oyun worked beside him, preparing the insulation that would make the system effective. Raw sheep's wool arrived from nearby ranches in heavy bundles that still carried the scent of the animals. Instead of cleaning and spinning it into thread, the couple packed it directly into the spaces around the pipes. Wool was an yamas, excellent insulator because the fibers trapped countless tiny pockets of air. Those pockets slowed the escape of heat, ensuring that warmth stored in the clay pipes would stay inside the cabin rather than leaking out into the cold Montana night. Layer by layer, the walls were filled until they formed thick barriers capable of holding warmth for long periods of time. When the construction finally reached completion in late September, the cabin looked almost ordinary from the outside. Just another log structure sitting quietly in the valley. Yet hidden within its walls was more than 200 feet of clay pipe and hundreds of pounds of wool insulation working together as a single system. Batbyer knew the real test would arrive with the first deep freeze of winter. Until then, his neighbors continued to watch with curiosity and doubt, wondering whether the strange design would keep the Mongolian family warm or turn their home into the coldest house in the valley. The first serious cold arrived earlier than many expected. In early November, the calm autumn air of the valley suddenly shifted as a sharp northern wind pushed down from Canada. Within a single night, the temperature dropped far below freezing, coating the fields with a brittle layer of ice that glittered beneath the pale morning sun. For most settlers, this change signaled the beginning of the long winter routine. Chimneys began smoking constantly as families lit their stoves earlier in the day and kept them burning late into the night. Firewood piles shrank steadily as cabins fought to keep the cold outside. Batbyer prepared for the coming season differently. Instead of rushing to ignite a stove indoors, he walked out to the stone-lined pit beside his house and started a controlled fire there. Dry pine and juniper branches burned steadily beneath the iron grate covering the pit, sending hot smoke down into the underground channel leading toward the cabin. Inside the house, something subtle but remarkable began happening. As the smoke entered the clay pipe network hidden within the walls, the heat carried by the smoke started transferring into the clay itself. At first, the change was barely noticeable. The walls simply felt less cold than the outside air. But as the fire continued burning for several hours, the clay pipes gradually absorbed more and more heat. That warmth slowly spread through the thick, wool-packed walls surrounding them. By late evening, the interior of the cabin no longer felt like a typical frontier structure battling the cold. Instead of one hot corner near a stove and icy drafts along the floor, the air inside the small home felt evenly comfortable. The walls themselves had become gentle sources of warmth, quietly releasing the heat they had stored earlier in the day. When night arrived, the outside temperature fell sharply again. Frost formed across the valley, and the wind carried a biting chill that forced most settlers indoors. In neighboring cabins, men and women stayed awake longer than usual, feeding extra wood into their stoves before going to bed. They knew the danger of letting the fire fade during the night. If the flames died completely, the cold would creep into the house long before morning. Batbuyer, however, allowed the fire in the pit to burn down to glowing embers before returning inside. Once the flames were gone, the smoke traveling through the pipes gradually cooled and finally drifted out through the vent on the far wall of the cabin. Yet even after the fire had completely disappeared, the house remained warm. Oyun noticed it first when she pressed her palm against the interior wall before sleeping. Instead of the icy surface she had expected, the clay plaster felt faintly warm to the touch. The warmth was not intense like the blast of heat from a stove. It was softer, steadier, almost like standing beside sun-warmed stone. Through the night, that warmth continued radiating from the walls, slowly, releasing the energy stored in the clay pipes. By morning, the outside temperature had fallen to levels that normally force settlers to restart their fires immediately after waking. Yet inside Batbuyer's cabin, the air still felt comfortable. Word about the strange house began spreading quickly after that first frost. Neighbors who had originally laughed at the design now rode past more slowly, sometimes stopping near the fence to observe the thin trail of smoke drifting from the distant vent pipe. They noticed something else as well. Batbuyer's woodpile seemed far smaller than everyone else's. While most families were already burning through large stacks of logs, the Mongolian couple used only modest bundles of branches to heat their home each day. Some settlers dismissed the situation as luck, believing the real test would come later when the harshest winter storms arrived. Batbuyer understood that as well. Early frost meant little in Montana. The valley was known for sudden, cold waves capable of pushing temperatures to dangerous extremes. When those days arrived, the efficiency of his unusual system would face its true challenge. Until then, he continued his routine calmly, lighting the morning fire in the pit, allowing heat to travel through the hidden pipes, and trusting the thick walls of clay and wool to hold that warmth long after the flames were gone. The true test arrived in the heart of January. A powerful Arctic front swept down from the north, bringing with it one of the coldest stretches of weather the valley had experienced in years. The temperature plunged quickly, dropping from a mild winter afternoon into dangerous territory overnight. By dawn, the thermometer outside several ranch houses had fallen past 30 degrees below zero. The wind made the cold even more brutal. Gusts raced across the open land, driving snow sideways through the air and forcing people indoors. Livestock struggled to reach shelter, and many ranchers spent the day. Stoves roared with such intensity that began their familiar winter battle against the freezing air, pressing in from outside, began their familiar winter battle against exhaustion. Throughout the night, someone always had to stay awake to feed more wood into the fire. Logs vanished quickly into the stove as flames consumed them, sending most of their heat straight up the chimney. Even with constant burning, frost crept along the inside edges of windows and door frames. Some cabins developed dangerous drafts when the wind pushed smoke backward through their chimneys. Others burned through their carefully prepared wood supplies far faster than expected. The cold snap turned every household into a small furnace struggling to survive. At the Ganserig homestead, however, the scene looked very different. Batbuyer followed the same routine he had practiced since autumn. Early each morning, he stepped outside into the bitter cold and lit a controlled fire in the stone pit beside the house. Dry branches and carefully split wood burned steadily beneath the iron grate, producing a column of hot smoke that disappeared into the underground channel leading toward the cabin. For several hours, the fire burned intensely, sending wave after wave of heated smoke through the clay pipes hidden inside the walls. Gradually, the pipes absorbed that energy and spread it through the thick wool insulation surrounding them. By the time the outside temperature reached its lowest point during the cold wave, the walls of the cabin had already stored a large reserve of heat. Inside, the air remained calm and comfortable. There were no roaring flames, no drifting smoke, and no frantic midnight trips to add wood to a stove. The warmth radiated gently from every side of the room, creating a steady temperature that barely changed through the night. Batbear and Oyen slept peacefully while the wind screamed outside and snow battered the valley. News of this quiet comfort spread quickly. One afternoon during the cold snap, a ranch hand riding through the valley decided to check on the Mongolian couple, assuming they might be struggling like everyone else. When he stepped inside their cabin, the difference surprised him immediately. Instead of the smoky air and uneven heat typical of frontier homes, he felt a soft warmth that filled the entire room. The walls themselves felt slightly warm to the touch. No stove burned nearby, no fire crackled inside the building, yet the temperature was far more pleasant than the cabins he had left behind. The rider returned to his ranch and reported what he had seen. Soon others began visiting as well, curious to witness the strange heating system they had once mocked. Many stood silently inside the cabin, pressing their palms against the clay walls and trying to understand how warmth could come from something other than fire burning in the room. For the first time, some settlers began to realize that Batbear's unusual design might not be madness at all. Instead, it hinted at a different way of surviving winter, one that relied less on endless wood and more on using heat wisely. By the time the cold wave finally loosened its grip on the valley, the reputation of Batbear Ganzarig's strange cabin had changed completely. Only a few months earlier, people had ridden past his land laughing at the idea of a house without a chimney. Now those same men arrived with notebooks, measuring ropes, and questions. They wanted to understand exactly how the system worked. One of the first visitors to return after the storm was a rancher who had spent nearly the entire week fighting to keep his bunkhouse stove alive. His eyes were red from smoke and lack of sleep, and his woodpile had nearly disappeared. When he stepped into Batbear's home and felt the steady warmth radiating from the walls, he stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the difference. There was no harsh blast of heat like the kind that came from standing too close to a stove. Instead, the entire room felt evenly comfortable, as if the building itself had become a gentle heater. Batbear explained the principle patiently, drawing simple diagrams in the dirt outside the cabin. The key was not the fire itself, he said, but how long the heat stayed inside the structure. In most frontier homes, flames burned fiercely for a short time, but their heat escaped almost immediately through the chimney and the thin wooden walls. His design forced the hot smoke to travel through more than 200 feet of clay pipe before leaving the house. During that journey, the heat transferred into the clay and surrounding insulation. Instead of escaping instantly, the energy remained trapped within the walls and slowly released into the room over many hours. The fire only needed to burn for a short time each day because the house itself had become a massive storage system for warmth. Several settlers quickly realized the advantages. Not only did the system use far less wood, it also removed many of the dangers associated with indoor fires. Frontier cabins caught fire more often than people like to admit. Sparks from a stove or fireplace could easily ignite dry timber walls, and smoke from poorly ventilated chimneys sometimes filled homes with dangerous fumes. Batbear's design eliminated those risks by keeping the fire completely outside the living space. The smoke traveled through sealed pipes before venting safely into the air far from where people slept. As winter slowly faded into spring, the idea began spreading across nearby ranches. A few curious homesteaders started experimenting with their own versions of the system, building small pipe channels beneath floors or inside thick walls. Some succeeded immediately. Others made mistakes and had to rebuild sections until the airflow worked properly. Batbayer never demanded payment for his advice. Whenever someone asked for guidance, he willingly demonstrated how to mix the clay, shape the pipes, and arrange the channels so the smoke could travel smoothly through the structure. To him, the knowledge was not something to guard, but something meant to be shared. The harsh winters of the frontier, he believed, were challenge enough without people wasting energy fighting them the wrong way. Years passed, and the valley continued growing as more settlers arrived. Many homes still relied on the traditional stove and chimney approach, but a small number of buildings quietly adopted the method Batbayer had introduced. Ranchers discovered that heating barns and bunkhouses with slow radiant warmth required far less fuel and labor than constantly feeding large fires. The idea slowly became part of local knowledge, passed from neighbor to neighbor the same way Batbayer had learned it long ago on the distant Mongolian steppe. Long after the original cabin was eventually replaced by newer buildings, the lesson it represented remained clear. Winter had not been the true enemy of the frontier settlers. The real problem had been how they used the heat they created. By understanding that warmth could be captured, stored, and released slowly, Batbayer Ganzarig had demonstrated a simple truth. Survival in harsh environments often depends less on brute force and more on wisdom. Knowing how to make the resources you already have work far more effectively.